The artist has once again found herself trapped in a Pinterest doom scroll, passing pin after pin, looking for something undefined known as inspiration. But then she sees it. Yes, this could be it, she thinks as she clicks. Ah, inspiring. Egg tempura. Greetings and salutations. I'm Sky and I make art. And today I've got a dozen eggs to crack. So, let's get cracking. Egg tempura is an old kind of paint. Like, so old that they were still using those snails to get that beautiful, fishy smelling purple that royals like to flaunt about. And as the name suggests, it's made with these very eggs I have before me. Liquid gold, really. But before we can start painting, we have to make our paint. And to do that, we must collect our ingredients. Starting with our pigment of choice, I decided to go with something called the lazy method, and got my mitts in a box of chalk pastels. We shall grind these into the finest of pigments. Next comes the sparkling spring water, and the sourest of vinegar from the westmost orchard. Last, we select our egg. Look at this fine specimen. Beautiful, pallid shell, smooth, egg-shaped, perfect for the job. Let's break Humpty Dumpty and extract his guts, which we shall roll dry in our palms. Next, we prick it like Sleeping Beauty to collect its inner liquid. This gold shall be the base of our paint, and in fact it actually has natural light-fast qualities that can only be explained through magic. Combine with equal parts liquid glass, and just a dash of your sour soul. Let's not overdo that part. Mix, and then add to the dust of your enemies. Lastly, mix with a sharp object on crystal until you have a creamy paste. I'm using the sharp object known as a palette knife. Oh look, it's all done. Lovely. Shall we start painting? It only feels right that the first thing I try to paint with this paint would be an egg. But not just any egg. An egg would be boring. Let's make it a colorful egg. Maybe even a dragon's egg. Okay, well my technique leaves a lot wanting. But you get the idea. I try to use an old Masters limited palette, but since I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing with these colors, it was definitely a lot harder to mix anything that didn't look sad and muddy. So don't judge me too hard. Or do. That's your business, I guess. So I made a sketch, used magic to transfer it, and boom, ready for paint. I'm also painting on a unfinished ceramic tile. I wanted to mimic the sort of old-fashioned technique of fresco secco, which means painting on dried plaster. And since I wasn't about to go out and steal a chunk of house from some old dig site, this was the closest I could get. And if you must know, the little goober I'm painting is Bernard. He's one of my characters, and basically his whole thing was he was like tricked into eating toast by a fae, and now he has like infinite life, and also he loves toast, but he also hates it. And so now he's out on this grand, epic quest to not only find the way to make the perfect toast, which he always burns everything, poor guy, and to go find that fae and kick his butt. Oh, and in case you were wondering, yes, he does smell like cinnamon. But why would you be wondering that? That's weird. You should get some help. And now, for the segment of the show where I come on and I tell you my scientific findings in the properties of egg paint. The closest thing I can compare it to is gouache, and if you're unfamiliar with gouache, it's basically like a really thick watercolor or a cross between watercolor and acrylics. Tempera is a fairly thick paint, and it works best in thin layers. If you apply it in a slightly thicker layer though, you can get a pretty high coverage. An added bonus of working in thin layers is the fact that the layers below it will show through a little bit, adding a kind of luminous quality. I was working on a ceramic tile for the final piece here, and unfortunately when I put down everything it kind of just absorbed straight away. However, when I was working on the egg painting earlier, you could draw out that pigment for ages. Like one dab, and you can basically cover an entire page. Fantastic. An issue I had while working on this piece was how quickly everything dried. Not just because I was working on ceramic tile, but because the paint itself dries very quickly. I had to keep misting my palette to make sure it didn't dry out before I finished using the paint. And once that paint dried, it was staying there. It was not going anywhere. I tried to revive it a couple times, but if it was fully dried, the game was over. So I guess these are more like ancient acrylic gouache than just normal gouache. This was kind of a pro and a con for me, since it was very nice when I was trying to layer colors. However, it was definitely hard to use the paint that I had in the small mixes before it finished drying out. Another thing I noticed while working with this food paint was how smooth the lines you can get were. I did not do it justice in this piece, but when I was drawing out those lines, it was smooth as butter. Also, a small note about that pretty big color shift you see when I'm using the paint on the ceramic tile. That's the tile's fault, not the paint. When I was working on the egg, it didn't shift like that. You could put down water on that thing and it would look like you dunked it in coffee. Alright, that concludes my notes on the findings of this time ancient food paint research. So back to our regularly scheduled program. My final rating for this breakfast paint is a resounding 4 stars. I had to knock a star off for being so tedious to make and for drying so quickly. However, how smooth the paint was, how much coverage you could get from just a small dab, and how fun it was to tell people you painted it with your breakfast made up for those shortcomings. If you want to try making this paint yourself, I would highly recommend it. Just make sure you put aside a solid block of time so that way you don't get interrupted and have to remake your paint a few times. Anyways, if you want to help me out, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll catch you later, my lovelies.